Acceptance can be talked about in a lot of different ways. And I think the most confusing part is that we believe to practice acceptance, that means not feeling the sort of emotions that come as a result of not accepting. So the frustration, the anger, the disappointment, whatever it is that sort of, you know, that excitement that we had and the expectations that we were leading with, however that sort of becomes nullified and is put to a dead end, that's the time to practice acceptance. And just because we feel frustrated, just because we feel angry doesn't mean we can't practice acceptance. We don't have to, exist in a crazy stoic state to practice acceptance. We could be angry and we can accept our anger, we can accept our disappointment, we can accept our frustration, and we can also let things be as they are. So when we're looking at all the situations in our life, when we're looking at, relationships or whatever else, we find it hard to accept the way that things are playing out. And we believe that, I don't know, because we experience the disappointment of the fallout or the frustration of the expectations not being met. We believe that because we feel those things that we can't practice acceptance. But how to practice acceptance is to exist in those states without letting them sort of influence your actions in a way that you would regret. So when you find disappointment, don't let that sort of trigger a spiral of anger and lashing out on other people, and especially those who have, maybe nothing to do with your frustrations. Don't take it out on other people. Accept what is actually occurring, accept the fact of the matter, and take it for what it is. That's what it is. That's how the situation is presenting itself. So how are we going to adapt? How are we going to exist now and be present with whatever has presented itself to us? The opposite of acceptance is trying to make something what you thought it would be before it came to a close. And I know that sentence might sound a little bit confusing. But what I mean is to say you had a certain expectation, you had a plan, and that thing falls short of what you imagined. You try to go back in time, you try to do whatever you can to mold it and try to situate and fix it to be what it once was or what you once imagined it to be. But that's not how acceptance works. And that's only going to build more frustration and anger because now you're trying to control other people, you're trying to control other aspects of your life that are just going to sort of resist and sort of give you that energy back. And it's just not going to be helpful for anyone or anything. So learning to let go and learning to accept things as they are, it's not necessarily a practice of life and it's not necessarily a philosophical practice, but really it's a practice in not allowing our temporary emotions to have more dire consequences by influencing our actions. You can observe the anger, you can observe the frustration, you can feel it deeply, and you can breathe through it and simply let it go. Acknowledge, you could say, I am frustrated, I am angry, I am disappointed, but I accept what has occurred and I can learn from it, I can understand it, and most importantly, I can observe the way I react. And actually, we can do something really interesting and we can ask ourselves, why are we so disappointed? Why are we so frustrated? Why are we so angry? Sorry, why are we so angry? And a lot of times what we're going to find is has much to do with either a dependency on future events, expectations. Sort of we've been looking forward a lot and we haven't been making the most of the present moment. Or maybe it's a dependency on other people's actions. So we're constantly looking to other people to sort of fill that void within us. And when those people act in a way that disappoints us or negates our expectations, we sort of lash out and we start to blame everyone. But everyone is free to make their own choices. And we can't force other people to act and behave in a way that we would. And I think actually detaching and letting go from other people doesn't involve doing it from a place of resentment. It doesn't involve doing it a place of anger, but really it's acceptance for what is. There's a practice, and it's a sort of interpersonal practice, but and I saw it on a post. I've seen it a bunch of times. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it, but it's the practice of not reaching out to anyone and seeing how long it takes for someone to reach out to you. And I think this is an important practice because not only does it show us the value and what we sort of need to accept in our relationships, but it shows us where we're maybe putting more energy in and that energy is not being reciprocated. And see what happens when you mind your own and you do things with the self-confidence of being an individual with your own choices, and see what happens when you take the power out of other people's hands to determine your happiness and your satisfaction out of life. We can sort of look another way. When we're finding a lot of frustration, whether with people or whether situations or events, look another way. Look at the path next to you. What is an alternative to what you've been doing? What you've been doing has been leading to a lot of disappointment, a lot of the same cycles, repeating and repeating, and you're tired of that. And because you're tired of that, you're finding trouble accepting things because you know and you want more out of your life. And you're tired of the same sort of shit happening over and over. And the only way to stop that stuff from happening over and over is a difference in actions. So maybe acceptance doesn't actually have to be just sort of digesting what has occurred in the present moment and dealing with our emotions, though it can be just that. It can also be a sign that it's time to walk another direction. It's time to take another path. You know, maybe take a break from those social groups where you're not valued completely. It doesn't need to mean that, but it can mean that. And you don't have to be radical with it. You don't have to go all the way in the opposite direction. But an important thing to realize is that when loops are repeating, when the same frustrations keep occurring, it may be time to look at things from a different angle. It might be time to walk a different path. And it's important that we don't do this in the name of that frustration, but we do it as a result of accepting that frustration. So we don't start frantically looking to other people for validation and dependency. We don't start doing that. We sit with the frustration we've been feeling, we accept it, and as a result of that acceptance, we ponder the other paths that have been to our left and to our right, and we see, how have I been maybe blind to the other ways I must walk this path called life? Have I been maybe avoiding different paths because I'm emotionally attached to the one and my expectations of this path has been so set in stone for so long that I want it to be something that I have no control over whether it really will be that or not? And I think what happens as a result of not practicing acceptance and not pondering the other ways to move about and throughout life, what happens is we are now just met with all of that frustration and we don't know what to do with it. And then we start to become miserable. We start to suffer more because we grow confused and we grow impatient. We want things to change immediately because our expectations have been sort of sliced down and the path that we thought we were walking has come to a sort of dead end. And I'm not speaking in terms of a purposeful path, but this can mean anything. This can mean, you know, a relationship path or even a fitness path. It doesn't matter. It can work in any sort of regard. There's many different little paths that we walk in our life. But what happens is we cling to one because we're so used to it and we thought, that's what was going to give us what we wanted. But sometimes we don't even realize that we've actually found comfort in those same sort of cycles repeating. And we thought that we can break those cycles doing the same sort of actions, being with the same sort of people, and experiencing the same sort of frustrations. We believed that even amidst this, we would be able to get what we want. And maybe that's simply not the case. Maybe our expectations that we set, maybe they were unrightfully put where they were placed. Maybe we shouldn't have our expectations so high of other people. Maybe we shouldn't have our expectations so high of that future plan. Maybe that person was always planning to sort of disappoint you. Maybe that plan was never ever going to come to fruition and no part of it was ever going to come to fruition. So this entire time, we're not actually frustrated with the people. We're not actually frustrated with the plan. We're frustrated with our own inability to see how those things would have happened before they happened. But we can't do that. We can't hold anger for ourselves for not knowing things ahead of time. You know, a lot of times we like to sort of resent ourselves because we couldn't see things that are so obvious to us now. We couldn't see them before. But that's the way of life. And if you're always trying to sort of jump the gun and you're always trying to get ahead of whatever you think is going to happen, that's another expectation. That's another dependency. You're not practicing acceptance. Acceptance is in the present moment, but acceptance doesn't have to sort of negate the way that we move forward. You know, we don't have to accept that we were ignorant. We don't have to accept that we might have been stubborn. We don't have to accept that we might have been blind to certain things. We can simply accept what has occurred without adding fuel to the fire. And I think a good practice is, within this acceptance, ponder and maybe think to yourself, not, engaging with thoughts, but, there's other ways to go about it, a sort of deep, remembering of, what are the other options that I have? Within a reasonable mindset, not within a place of anger, not within a place of frustration or even entitlement, but rather, what are the other options that I have so I'm not so dependent on a singular path? How can I open myself up more to new opportunities? How can I open more doors than have been opened for me now? And this can be something that is hard to realize, and especially when we find comfort within certain people, within certain paths. We don't want to sort of go out of our way and inconvenience ourselves to experience a new sort of path and a new door opening, because it's going to take a lot of work. But like I always say, the difficult things are what's going to lead us to the good outcomes. So when we experience, a sort of comfortable path that has been frustrating us, that has been disappointing us for a while now, maybe it's time to ponder, have we been taking the easy route to the things we wanted? And it might be time to move ourselves into that which is more difficult. And of course, we don't want to do this naturally, right? Who wants to leave something that's flowing kind of easily and kind of moving along and treading along for a path that's probably going to be more tense, more awkward, more difficult to get the things we want? But sometimes that's what's needed from us. Because maybe that frustration you've been feeling, the amount of disappointment and being let down you've been feeling, maybe that's because of the comfort, that's because of the easiness. You've learned to accept that frustration and discomfort. Sorry, not discomfort, that frustration and disappointment as a part of that path. But maybe you don't have to experience that frustration and disappointment all the time. Maybe it's just that path. Maybe it's just those people. And maybe you need to switch it up. Maybe you need to stop placing so much power, so much responsibility on these people or on that path, and open yourself up to a new one that is slightly more inconvenient, one that is slightly more sticky, but one that you would have never thought would have been the way to go about it. We want so bad for the easy route and for the sort of people that we've spent more of the time with in the past to be the group and the situation and the events that are going to lead us to what we really want. But the universe has a funny way of pushing us into things that are of greater inconvenience and more difficulty, so we can grow and actually be that person that will align with the energy of what we want. And we have to be very careful not to cling to our assumptions and, not try to defend being right over finding the truth of what we want and who we are. A lot of times we'll judge maybe other groups of people that we haven't spent enough time with. Maybe we'll judge how they will perceive us. Maybe we'll judge how the path would unfold if we were in their company. Maybe we've been too quick to jump to conclusions and to label people and to label situations and to label different paths. Maybe we've been too quick to judge those things. Maybe those places, maybe those people, maybe that path is actually slightly more fulfilling than you would have initially guessed. Maybe those people are more open-minded than you would have thought. Maybe that path is available, open, and sort of more momentum induced than the path you've been walking. Paradoxes and opposites often reveal to us where we've been clinging and where we've been sort of trying to hold on to expectations, even though those expectations maybe never would have come to fruition. Maybe you don't need to accept these same cycles of frustration and disappointment. Maybe it's time to make a change, walk a different path, enjoy a different company. It's not always the case, but within acceptance comes a reasonable voice, comes a reasonable perspective that offers a counterpoint, a counter path, a counter way to the one we've already been walking. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this episode may be a tiny bit all over the place, but I was trying to sort of nail a sort of widened and foreign concept. But for those of you listening on Spotify, thank you. For those of you listening and watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe. And I appreciate you guys as always. You can always buy my books at shop-kidsr.com or on Amazon. But anyways, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.